"Sir, speak forthwith. We found some men, they are still alive. Lead me thither, perchance they can clarify this perplexing circumstance." Alphonse's voice dripped with disappointment as he surveyed the unfolding situation. As one of the knight commanders serving under Lord Theodore Valerian, he understood the necessity of less than honourable undertakings if they furthered his lord's ambitions. On this day, his task was to ensure the secrecy and profitability of their underground slave trade partner in this city. Though he harboured no fondness for the merchant involved, he recognized the significance of this off-the-books income the operation generated. In the cutthroat struggle for succession among the heirs, money was a vital weapon, and not all of it could be acquired through legitimate means or sponsors. Alexander Valerian, the current duke, remained silent until concrete evidence emerged and understood that every move was part of the ongoing war for power. He had gone through the same process, and all his children had heard rumors of some of his undertakings, some involving outright assassination. Alphonse followed the subordinate who was holding up a lantern. The area was now aglow with hand lanterns held by the mercenaries hired by the merchant leader, with his own men nearby on standby. He couldn't entirely rely on this man to keep things quiet. The young lady from the rival merchant group was meant to have been dealt with the day prior, but she had somehow survived and even managed to escape from this very location. To his knowledge, a powerful Tier 3 mage had appeared in the city, prompting him to intervene personally. As they approached the fallen men, Alphonse scrutinized them with a trained eye. The three thugs were battered and bruised, but still conscious. Their clothes were singed and evidence of the magic was hanging in the air. It seemed plausible that this mage had been hired by someone, considering his previous interventions to save the young lady from the rival merchants. However, it was also conceivable that he belonged to a rival faction, aiming to disrupt their operation, an angle Alphonse needed to investigate further. "Pray, do clarify what events have unfolded in this vicinity," the knight commander ordered, but before any of the men could answer, something caught his eye. It was only thanks to his senses he was made aware of a disturbance, a strange round object covered in glowing runes. His instincts screamed danger, and without hesitation, he darted in the opposite direction while pushing the mercenaries out of his way. "Hey! What?" The men were surprised, but almost instantly after, multiple explosions rocked the entire area. The force of the explosions sent shockwaves rippling through the ground, knocking down anyone and anything in their path. Debris flew through the air as flames erupted from the detonation points, casting an eerie glow over the chaos. Alphonse, propelled by instinct and years of combat experience, managed to evade the worst of the blasts and jump to a safe distance as the fiery blasts engulfed the area where he had just stood. As the smoke cleared and the echoes of the explosions faded, Alphonse rose to his feet, his eyes scanning the surroundings. His armor was scorched, and his cloak singed in several places, but otherwise, he remained unharmed. The aftermath was quite devastating, with the ground having collapsed and the building he was just in reduced to rubble. The noise effectively woke up all the nearby residents, and quite a few of the mercenaries had been killed or injured. "Sir Alphonse, are you injured?" "I am unharmed." An armoured man with the Valerian emblem arrived soon after. He was his second in command and only answered to his orders. "Sir, should we check for survivors?" "Leave them be. Our immediate concern lies elsewhere. The perpetrator of this act cannot have ventured far. We seek a mage garbed in dark garbs, likely endeavouring to flee the city. Secure the city perimeter. Permit no one to depart." The knight commander issued his order, displaying his indifference towards the mercenaries. Quickly, he donned his helmet, distinguished by a blue comb atop, then pivoted on his heel. "Yes, sir. As you command." His subordinate saluted once more before darting off towards the other knights. Many of them lingered outside in the streets, ready to assemble at a moment's notice. The city was in turmoil, with shouts and cries echoing through the streets as residents and guards alike scrambled to make sense of the explosions. The one responsible for this disaster, however, was making his way through one of the city gates, his escape seen by some guards who could only watch. There goes my cover, but at least I've managed to leave the city, and it should take them a while to assemble their forces to pursue me, but when they do, they will eventually catch up. Roland breathed a sigh of relief as they passed through the city gates and entered the open road beyond. The chaos and confusion of the explosions had likely diverted attention away from their escape, at least for the time being. However, they were not out of danger yet, and the way this wagon was moving was concerning. It looked more like a train cart than a carriage. While it was robust, it was not created for speed. It required a large monster to pull it, and turning would also be a problem. He assumed that whoever would be after them, would be on horseback and much faster. Eventually, they would catch up to them if they continued at this pace. Roland knew they needed to find a way to go around this problem, and there were a few choices. First choice, I drop off the kids somewhere and try luring away our pursuers. Probab, why not a good idea, even the weakest monster they encounter will kill them all. There is no food here either, so letting them hide somewhere and then returning is also out of the question. What else can I do? Roland glanced back into the wagon where 10 individuals were resting. The farmer boy who asked him for help was trying to calm down his friends while also explaining to everyone that everything will be okay. The other 5 were of similar age as this group and for some reason had trusted him with their lives. Discarding them now would be a betrayal of that trust, and Roland had already made a decision. If we can't split up, then only one choice remains, pushing through to the border. Some luck was on their side, as this settlement that they had left wasn't that far off from Albrook, and more importantly, the lands that were Arthur's territory. While in the past they were unable to halt Theodore's troops from trespassing, things had changed. If they gathered all of their soldiers and he was there to lead them, then this issue could be potentially resolved. With this in mind, the runes on his helmet lit up slightly as he tried reaching the most important person for this plan to work. Common pickup. He looked at a pulsating representation of his magical call not being answered and continued to wait. There were no phones in this world or culture built around them, so it was possible to wait hours for someone to answer, but luckily, after a few minutes he heard a familiar voice. Roland, I've heard that you were returning, are you nearby? It was the voice of his favorite bastard son of the Duke, Arthur Valerian. The two hadn't really talked in a month since Roland's departure, and he just sent him some text messages or pre-recorded voice lines to just confirm that he was still alive. Not quite, I'll assume that if you are using my real name, you are somewhere private. Yes, I'm in my private quarters. You were lucky that I was working late, but are you sure you're not somewhere close? I need you to go through some of the city plans. I will when there is some time, but first, I need you to help me. I'm in some trouble and I need you to assemble the soldiers from Albrook. Assemble them? What kind of trouble are you in, Roland? I'll explain later, but for now, I need you to gather as many soldiers as you can. I'm heading towards the western border of your territory, towards Albrook. From the western side? Isn't that in Theodore's region? Arthur paused for a moment, but it didn't take him too long to figure out why Roland mentioned the border and the soldiers. It is. I've gotten myself in some trouble. It does sound, very well. I'll gather everyone up, but it could take a while. How many do you exactly need, and do they have to be combat ready? Roland was a bit surprised that Arthur didn't inquire about the situation more. It seemed that just asking was enough to make this young city lord move his troops. I'd say, everyone that's available, the more the better, even the new trainees. When they get there, just wait at the edge and don't cross through the border. Tell them to wait for a large carriage, one that slave traders use. I see, the numbers count, and a slave carriage, that's peculiar, but I understood. I'll send out the orders immediately. Hold tight, Roland. Help is on the way. Thank you, Arthur. I owe you one. You sure do, my friend, and I hope you know what you are doing. I hope so, and there is one last thing. Relief washed over Roland as Arthur accepted his plea for assistance. The soldiers en route from Albrook weren't solely dispatched to aid him against his pursuers, they served more as a contingency plan. Perhaps trouble could still be averted if his adversaries were sluggish, but there was a reason behind his worries. The presence of the Valyrian knight near the city gate caught him off guard, and it indicated a potential threat that could be coming. "All right, everyone, listen up." Roland's voice rang out, drawing the attention of the wagon's occupants, who quickly turned towards him. He could see the fear in some of their eyes, but luckily Vico was there to calm them down. The boy seemed to trust him for some reason, and this helped immensely. "We have a long journey ahead of us, and it won't be an easy one. But I need you all to remain calm and trust me. We're going to make it through this together. I swear that I won't let any harm befall any of you. Our destination is to the east of here, near the city of Albrook." Some of the children didn't fully grasp his words, but at least they weren't crying. Roland spoke softly and slowly, hoping to reassure them and make his instructions clear. However, only time would tell if they would remain calm when trouble eventually arrived. With that, they continued their journey through the main road, which proved to be a bumpy ride. As they traveled along the winding roads, Roland kept watch for any signs of pursuit. The moon was starting to go down and the night was starting to draw to a close. However, before dawn arrived, he noticed signs of trouble in the distance. There were several men on horses, with lanterns strapped to their mounts, clearly chasing after them. It has to be a scouting party. They were quite a bit away from them, but their speed was above theirs. Vico, the boy tasked with keeping the others calm, sensed that something was wrong. Roland's repeated glances into seemingly empty space did not go unnoticed. "Sir, is everything all right? We might be in some trouble." Trouble? Their pursuers persisted in their advance, the monstrous lizard unable to shake them off. The deteriorating condition of the road only worsened their situation and allowed the pursuers to steadily close the distance. Finally, Roland instructed the young man to take the reins while he ascended onto the wagon, with his hammer staff. Using his magic, he unleashed a homing missile spell and successfully drove them back. Their pursuit had been stalled, but it was not over yet. That was only the scouting party, there are a lot more coming from behind. It was clear that more enemies were coming, and now that he was spotted, they had a proper target. The road he was going through was uneven, but it was the only way for this large wagon to follow. If he attempted to stray away from this path, they would only be slower and their pursuers would catch up even faster. This left them in a predicament, as it was easy for their enemies to just follow the road. "Can't use the forests to lose them, we'll just get stuck, but I can make it a lot harder for them to catch up, and I don't need to reveal my identity quite yet." Roland was likely a known figure among the Valyrian knights, making the use of his spider golems and revealing his runic armor a risky action. However, the major advantage of utilizing runes lay in their adaptability. They could mimic nearly every spell, including divine ones or those from other schools of magic. He spent time at the institute learning various other types of magic, not only dimensional ones. "Vico, are you all right?" "Yes, sir, leave it to me." The young farmer boy was surprisingly good at keeping the monster steady. It was as if he had some former training in the past, but this was not the time to ask for more questions. Roland took on his potion on top of the slaver wagon and started his plan of stalling their pursuers. There are a lot of them. In the distance, a swarm of lanterns illuminated the night, each one marking the presence of a mounted knight. It was clear that he had been unlucky, as such a large battalion of knights was nearby. Not just anyone could command such a force, so he had to assume a knight commander was among them. Alongside, there were likely other Tier 3 class holders present. Even for Roland, these numbers would be too much to handle, so there was only one way for him and the kids to come out of this unscathed. He raised his staff and directed it towards the ground, causing the earth beneath to soften. From within his spatial space emerged an array of runic objects, some circular, others simple scrolls or metallic implements. Quickly, they were scattered onto the softened ground, concealed from view. Once the approaching army passed over them, they would face a rude awakening. Placing runic mines from scrap metal wasn't his sole strategy, especially as this place was also populated by various other creatures. There was a reason merchants traveled with adventurer protection, and Roland intended to capitalize on it. With another wave of his staff, he conjured a pale ball of light that materialized and gently descended to the ground, even as the carriage pressed forward. Emitting a peculiar pulse, the pale light began to draw the attention of the monsters dwelling in these lands. Some of the more aggressive creatures detected the monster beaconing spell emitted by the strange orb. While it didn't affect all of them, those drawn out could serve as a brief distraction. Though natural monsters lacked the relentless drive of dungeon creatures, certain types were known to pose a threat even to fully armored charging knights. Soon, the charging battalion reached the first roadblock and Roland could hear some explosions echoing from the distance. It was like music to his ears as he heard the continuous explosions which indicated a successful delay in their pursuers' progress. However, he couldn't afford to become complacent. He continued to lay down traps and obstacles, utilizing his knowledge of magic and the terrain to his advantage. As the chaos ensued behind them, the sounds of hooves continued to intensify and the monster howls were dying down. His pursuers were slowly gaining on them, but he was unwilling to stop. The children inside the wagon were surprisingly calm and Vico continued to steer the lizard in the right direction. As hours passed, Roland found himself forced to resume casting. This time, he conjured delayed magic arrows that hovered in mid-air. Once an enemy was in range, they would spring into action. However, their success was short-lived. The knights skillfully used their shields for defense, and even targeting their mounts failed to slow their advance. Time was clearly running out and his options were dwindling. Would they reach their territory in time or would their relentless pursuer catch up? "Yes, sir. What is it now?" "This creature, I don't think it will last for much longer, it's been running for almost a whole day." Roland concentrated on the soldiers gaining ground behind them, casting spells, and setting traps along their path. Despite his efforts to create distance, the pursuers consistently closed in. The primary obstacle was their wagon's speed. The lizard creature pulling it simply wasn't fast enough. It was good at maintaining a steady pace, but pushing it beyond that taxed its endurance. Roland cursed under his breath, realizing that eventually, the mounted knights would catch up to them. He needed to think of something and needed to do it fast. "Keep it steady, Vico." "Why yes, sir." The boy nodded, but it was clear that he was starting to panic. At first, it appeared that his spells were effective, but the relentless pursuit began to wear him down. As the soldiers spread out to the sides, they became much more difficult to handle. The traps had a limited area of effect, as did his spells. It felt akin to battling a hydra. For every obstacle he managed to overcome, 2 more emerged to take its place. "My mana reserves are running low, using so many spells is too taxing, and even the runes on this armor are starting to burn into the mithril. What can I do?" To aid in his decision-making, Roland brought up the map of the area while simultaneously scanning the surroundings with his own eyes. He knew they weren't far from his territory, but at their current pace, they would need more time. By his calculations, the enemy soldiers would likely catch up to them in around 30 minutes, potentially surrounding them once they did. They faced a steep hillside, with the road beginning to incline. Roland speculated that some of the knights may have maneuvered around the hill and were possibly lying in wait on the other side. Reaching the summit could mean being trapped between the two forces. While there was a chance to break through, it was risky. The wagon could falter, and once their momentum was stopped, they would be easy pickings for their pursuers. "This isn't that far. If I could just go in a straight line and avoid the soldiers on the other side, then it could be possible." His mind raced at a superhuman rate as he made all the calculations. The plan formed in his head, and there was one way of them reaching the end of the road in one fell swoop. It was a problematic strategy, but after examining the wagon they were in, he was inclined to believe that it could work. This wagon was made from mostly metal to hold the slaves inside. It should theoretically last through the spell. At that moment, Roland stood atop the wagon, gripping his staff tightly in his right hand. The wagon boasted a somewhat rectangular shape, its roof arching overhead, creating a faint oval surface upon which he could stand or walk. It reminded him faintly of a train cart from his old world, and it seemed sturdy enough for what he was about to attempt. I'll probably need to use the shield as the conduit and a few of the golems, but it should work. Vico, hold it steady like before, don't worry about the beast, we won't need it for much longer. When you are close to the top, tell me. Okay, sir. After a brief moment of deliberation, Roland made his decision. Vico, who still held the reins to the exhausted lizard beast, simply nodded in response. Though the boy appeared confused by Roland's statement, he seemed to trust in his judgment. Meanwhile, the other kids remained huddled inside the slave cart, occasionally peering out of small holes meant to allow some fresh air into the stuffy interior. A precaution probably only there, to keep the captured people from suffocating. Roland maintained his silence, unsure of how to approach speaking to the frightened children. Thanks to Vico, however, they no longer seemed to fear him. To them, he was beginning to appear as a savior, and he was determined not to betray that trust. Thus, to start off his plan, he placed his shield on the floor and did it precisely in the center of the wagon. Some of the children looked puzzled as he retrieved another shield from beneath his robes, and their confusion only deepened as strange cube-shaped objects began to float out. Let's get to work, I only have around half an hour to do this. First, Roland activated the enchantments on his robe, causing it to retract onto itself. The magic allowed it to transform into a belt and in turn revealed his fully armored form. Though he was reluctant to be seen like this by Theodore's men, inside the cart, he was shielded from unwelcome gazes. The children, however, could now see him clearly, and their young eyes were captivated by the glowing runes and magic before them. Step back a bit, it will get warm in here for a moment, but bear with it. After holding his fingers together, Roland conjured something akin to a controlled blowtorch. Despite his efforts to shield the area, some heat still seeped through, but the children remained undeterred, their eyes fixed on him as he melted the corners of his shield into the floor. Once complete, the shield was fully connected to the lesser steel of the wagon, forming the central platform for his plan. Roland pressed on with his task, retrieving a spare runic hammer that would aid him in inscribing everything with traces. With time ticking away, he wasted no time in swiftly moving around the cart, hammering key areas. With each swing, he created more trace routes for the runes that needed to cover the entire structure of the cart for his plan to work. As Roland meticulously inscribed the runes onto the wagon's surface, he could feel the pressure mounting. Time was ticking away, and the enemy soldiers were drawing closer with each passing moment. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he worked with unmatched focus. The children watched in awe as the intricate patterns of the runes began to take shape, their young minds unable to comprehend the full extent of Roland's magical prowess. To them, he seemed like an archmage from the tales they had heard, who wielded powers beyond their wildest imaginations. After the last runic trace was forced into place, Roland took a step back to survey his handiwork. The wagon was now adorned with a complex network of runic traces that connected to the shield in the middle. It wasn't his best work, nor would the metal hold for long, but this would have to do. He nodded in satisfaction, and it was just in time as Vico called out to him. "Sir, we're almost at the top and we are slowing down." "That's fine, you did well, Vico. Now go back inside, I'll take it from here." The boy looked quite exhausted as he was forced to stay up all night. As Vico retreated into the wagon, Roland let the robe expand over his body once more. With his runic armor covered again, he moved to the coachman's seat. There he was able to see that his assumption was correct, and they were indeed facing a large group of knights. They were positioned at the foot of the hill, and their leader stood out by wearing a distinctive helmet adorned with a large comb. "It's that commander I've met, this explains why they were able to organize so quickly. I guess, this is it. I really hope this thing lasts through it, otherwise this might get bloody." Roland did not wish to face these people out on the field. While they only numbered in the 30s, killing brought him no joy. Moreover, Even if he managed to defeat them all, the reinforcements approaching from behind would likely catch up, potentially exposing his true identity and causing trouble for Arthur. Nevertheless, Roland remained determined not to give up. He held on to the belief that his contraption would ultimately lead him back home. Everyone, hold on to something and don't let go, this might get a bit bumpy. Sir Alphonse, we can see the wagon, it's coming down the hill. Prepare yourselves. Ready the shielding artifacts at once. A group of armored men stood at the foot of the hill, their eyes fixed on the descending wagon. It was clear to them that the beast that was pulling it was starting to slow down, as it was even being pushed by the momentum of the cart as it descended. They were dealing with a powerful mage that had been evading their pursuit for more than a day. However, this would be where they corner this criminal. First off, a line of 10 men spread out, each one holding a shield enchanted to block spells. They understood that they were facing a spellcaster, and in such situations, magic was best countered with more magic. They speculated that their enemy was likely reaching the end of their mana pool. Casting spells for an extended period and continuously consuming mana potions would inevitably lead to toxicity backlash. Alphonse was well aware of this and awaited the opportune moment to strike. Behind the group of shield bearers, another 10 mounted knights stood, armed with hand crossbows. This was a new, specialized weapon capable of firing 2 bolts simultaneously. Enchanted to turn their ammunition into explosives upon collision, these crossbows were a large addition to their arsenal. Additionally, the mounted archers also carried longbows, ready to be employed once the crossbows were depleted. Then in the third row, stood the knight commander Alphonse himself, his imposing figure clad in ornate armor adorned with the sigil of House Valerian. Alphonse stood with his most trusted men, ready to engage the mage in melee combat once the wagon was brought to a halt. Their objective was not to negotiate or seek explanations, rather, they were there to silence him and ensure that no one ever knew of this encounter. "Sir! What seems to be the matter? Something is happening. Pray, elaborate on your statement. Speak clearly." Suddenly, a knight peering through a spyglass caught sight of something peculiar. He struggled to articulate what he saw to the knight commander but eventually answered the question. "Sir, the wagon, it seems to be rising. It is ascending." It didn't make sense to him, but he couldn't ignore the word of this knight, as he knew that none of them would ever lie to him. Instead, he moved his horse forward, to see with his own eyes if this wagon was indeed rising or if it was just tumbling down the hill. As Alphonse approached, his eyes widened in disbelief at the sight before him. The wagon, instead of hurtling down the hillside as expected, was indeed rising into the air. It defied all logic and expectation, leaving the knight commander momentarily stunned. The man quickly recovered and started shouting out orders to his men. "Ready yourselves. It appears to be a levitation spell, likely of temporary duration. The mage must be in dire straits." Alphonse's voice rang out, commanding authority and instilling confidence in his men. They swiftly adjusted their positions, readying themselves for whatever was to come. The shield-bearers tightened their grips on their enchanted shields, while the mounted knights readied their crossbows and longbows, aiming at the airborne wagon. The knight commander observed a figure. A lone man stood at the front. With a raised hand, the man conjured a blade made of blue flames, its intense heat unmistakable even from a distance. With precision, he brought the blade down, severing the connections between the wagon and the beast pulling it. As the wagon started soaring, the lizard creature was momentarily dragged upward. However, once the connections were cut, the beast fell down to the ground where it now rested. Their target, on the other hand, now liberated from its restraints, started to soar at an increased pace. Initially, it appeared that the increase in speed wouldn't be much. A levitation spell merely removed the weight but didn't provide any additional forward momentum. Alphonse anticipated that the wagon wouldn't move much faster than its current pace, which wasn't much more than before. He presumed their enemy was attempting to gain some distance, possibly with the intention of crashing the wagon and making an escape. However, Alphonse soon realized this was not the case. It continued to rise into the air and increase in speed. To make things worse, the mage that was in the front produced a strange spell. A dense grey mist enveloped the flying cart, concealing it entirely beneath a cloud-like veil. The magical cloud's size far exceeded that of the wagon, and was clearly there to hide it from view. Alphonse quickly turned to his men and gave an order. It seemed that their target was going to push through. Before it could go past them, it needed to be shot down. "What on earth are you all waiting for, you imbeciles? Utilize your crossbows post-haste and bring it down." The mounted knights immediately obeyed their commander's command, raising their hand crossbows and taking aim at the obscured wagon. With expert precision, they fired their enchanted bolts toward the moving target, hoping to bring it crashing down to the ground. The bolts streaked through the air and approached the strange mist cloud before exploding inside of it. At first, it seemed that the target had been hit, but to their surprise, the cloud continued to streak through the air, its speed continuously increasing as if it was unaffected. The cloud persisted in its forward movement, unaffected by the barrage of enchanted bolts unleashed by Alphonse's men. Despite the sound of multiple magical collisions, it showed no signs of slowing down. Soon the knights prepared for another volley, which, after being fired, was intercepted by a large shower of bolts of mana. These bolts homed in on each projectile with uncanny accuracy, colliding with them and triggering premature magical explosions. "Yes, sir, what do we do now?" one of the knights asked as the cloud containing the wagon streaked through the sky. They were not out of their range and their speed continued to increase. Alphonse gritted his teeth, his mind racing as he watched the scene unfold before him. Their target was getting away at a rapid pace that exceeded the capabilities of their horses, but in his mind, it was not over. "We gave chase. One of you shall remain and apprise the remainder of our company of our current location. But sir, if we continue any much further, then we will arrive in the territory of the other lord. I am cognizant of that fact, however, it holds no significance. The scoundrel is inconsequential. Let us depart ere he becomes aware of our presence." "Yes, sir." Alphonse urged his mount forward, leading his men in a swift pursuit of the airborne wagon that was rocketing into the distance. He knew that time was of the essence. If they allowed the mage to reach the territory of another lord, it would complicate matters greatly. While he didn't fear the man known as Arthur Valerian, he knew that his knight commander was strong. Their priority was to apprehend the rogue mage and to bring him back into their territory. As long as they weren't caught red-handed, the other party would be powerless to intervene. The pursuit continued, but unbeknownst to Alphonse, the young Valerian noble whom he had no respect for, wasn't far away. A battalion of well over 100 armored soldiers was not far from here, and more seemed to be coming. They were all gathering at one specific location, which was on the path between Aldbourne and Albrook. "Lord Arthur, are you sure this is the correct spot?" "This should be it, we just need to wait and Wayland will arrive. He even gave me the map location, the coordinates should be correct." A man adorned in fashionable armor, distinguished by his silvery white hair, sat astride a regal-looking steed. Beside him stood a woman, standing firmly on her own 2 feet. Her most striking feature was her feline ears, which set her apart amidst the armored soldiers and knights. Despite her unusual appearance, she held an air of importance, evident in her ability to converse with their leader. Not long after, the two were alerted to something approaching from a distance. A strange blazing inferno hurtled toward them, streaking like a star from the direction their ally was supposed to arrive. The man named Arthur squinted with his eyes as he tried to ascertain what this thing was. "Is that the fabled meteor spell? Lord Arthur, it's coming right for us. Spread out. Take cover behind the rocks and trees, protect yourselves." Their leader shouted at his soldiers and knights, quickly telling everyone to take cover. The meteor was hurling right for them, and if it was really the fabled spell of old, then the explosion would be devastating. "Damn, it's barely holding together, but we're not far from the meeting spot. We are going to die." Roland's thoughts were abruptly interrupted by the shouts of one of the children as the space around them began to unravel, causing the metallic wagon to tremble violently. After he had inscribed runes around them, the cart turned into an impromptu flying ship. His cube golems were used as propulsion and hidden within a magical mist he had conjured up to hide them. During their escape, they sustained several hits, which Roland countered by erecting a magical shield around them. However, the strain of maintaining the flying construct took its toll, resulting in more damage than he anticipated. Nonetheless, they continued flying until the runes began melting through the steel chassis. Now surrounded by flames, Roland urged the children to huddle around the tower shield he had melted to the ground. "Hey! No one is going to die, just gather around me, I promise you, no one will die." Roland shouted over the roar of the flames and the creaking of the metal. He focused his remaining mana into a large spherical mana shield. It enveloped the shield he was kneeling on along with the children that huddled around him. "The runic structures have deteriorated too much, I can't control the flight path anymore and the levitation spell is coming undone, the landing will be rough." Without voicing his concerns to the group, Roland remained focused on maintaining his concentration. After over a day of being chased, he had depleted most of his mana and was suffering from a headache induced by mana potion consumption. Fortunately, his skills allowed him to persevere through the pain. Before long, the mana solidified around them, forming a thick sphere of watery energy that enveloped them all. The children, wide-eyed with fear, clung to Roland as the wagon shuddered and groaned under the strain. The heat was intense, but thanks to the water magic around them, they were shielded from the worst of it. Roland placed his arms around the children to add another layer of protection with his body, and the wagon continued to descend rapidly, hurtling toward the ground below. As they approached the earth, Roland braced himself for impact. The sphere of mana surrounding them absorbed much of the shock, but even so, the landing was rough. The wagon crashed down with a deafening roar, sending up a cloud of dust and debris. The metal groaned and protested under the strain, and eventually burst into a ball of flames around them. Once the dust settled, the children opened their eyes. They found themselves suspended in mid-air, surrounded by a watery shield that promptly dissipated. After ignoring the sensation of wetness, they turned their attention to the wreckage of the wagon they had just been in. They realized that during the descent, Roland had reactivated the levitation capabilities of his shield and safeguarded them from the impact. "Is everyone all right?" he asked the children, his voice hoarse from all the accumulated exhaustion. They nodded in response, and soon felt themselves descending toward the ground. However, the landing was abrupt, and they experienced a gentle bump as they touched down. Though their savior attempted to land more slowly, it was evident that he was nearing the limits of his power. Soon, their eyes fell upon a group of armored men bearing the same crest as their pursuers. The children were startled by their sudden appearance, but Roland remained composed. He recognized their leader, someone he knew well. As the armored men approached, they too recognized Roland and quickly saluted him, who was their knight commander. "That was quite the entrance, Sir Wayland. Good to see you, Lord Arthur." Roland stood up straight and quickly performed a knightly salute to Arthur, who to everyone gathered here, was his lord. While he wanted to do nothing more than to get all of this behind him, there was still more left to do in this little scheme he cooked up. "I'm glad to see you also, and almost in one piece. However, we will catch up later, we have made the appropriate preparations." Arthur winked at Roland before glancing to the side, where a robed man stood, roughly Roland's height. Beneath the darkened robes, he wore armor similar to Roland's, giving him a striking resemblance to the individuals their pursuers were after. Now that he was among his allies, he could rearrange his robe to take on the form of a cape, adorned with a Valyrian crest on the back. "You have my thanks. Hey Wayland, what is this all about? Care to explain?" "Hey, give him some space, you big idiot, can't you see that he is tired? Hey, why did you kick me?" Two familiar voices sounded out from the distance, and they belonged to his brother-in-law and his younger sister. Both Armand and Lobelia had gathered along with Sir Gareth and Morian. Lobelia was on horseback while it seemed that Armand had used his own body to keep up with the mounted soldiers. All of them were now Tier 3 class holders and were just the backup he needed. Roland let out a weary chuckle as he spotted those two approach. Despite the dire circumstances, their presence brought him a sense of relief. He took a moment to compose himself before addressing them. "Armand, Lobelia, it's good to see you both. I'll explain everything, but first, let's get this over with. Troops from Aldbourne are approaching and we need to deal with them first." "Aldbourne? That shithole," Armand commented before receiving another kick to the shoulder from Lobelia. It was rather odd to see her kicking a man from horseback, but at least the sight brought the tension down. The soldiers didn't voice their opinions, but they wore strange expressions on their faces, clearly unused to seeing people behave in such a way around nobility. "How dare you behave in such a way in front of the Lord?" "Haha, it's fine, Mary, it's quite entertaining." Roland looked at the group that was assembled and wasn't sure what to think. Arthur seemed to be taking things quite lightly, but considering that he now had a proper Tier 3 entourage, he couldn't blame him. While his own horse was being prepared, he took a bit of time to look at Gareth and Morian, who were now a force to be reckoned with. "Name?" Gareth asked Estelle L153. "Classes: T3 Sword Champion L3. T2 Advanced Sword Knight L50. T2 Sword Knight L50. T1 Squire L25. T1 Warrior L25. Name: Morian Hartmond L152. Classes: T3 Spear Champion L2. T2 Advanced Spear Knight L50. T2 Spear Knight L50. T1 Squire L25. T1 Warrior L25. Vico, don't worry. You can trust these people, go with them until we deal with those people that were after us, do you understand?" "Yes, sir." Time was of the essence, and he needed to play the role until the very end. Vico was on his side, so he didn't need any convincing. With his help, the other kids moved with some of the soldiers who were tasked with bringing them to a safe location. Troops of an opposing Valyrian brother were approaching, and this place was far from safe. As the soldiers escorted the children to safety, Roland and his allies prepared themselves for the impending confrontation with the troops from Aldbourne. They positioned themselves strategically, taking advantage of the natural terrain to maximize their defensive capabilities. Their numbers were high and probably exceeded Theodore's troops. Their goal was to scare them off and not to engage, but things didn't always go as planned. "Sir Wayland, your friends are approaching. Did you have anything in mind for this event?" "My lord, it would be best to keep them from entering your territory, it would showcase your strength and send a message to you, brother." Dear Theo won't like this." Roland was now situated on his horse, right behind Arthur. His two knights didn't fully trust him yet, and the same went for Mary, who was responsible for their information network. Their leader appeared to be pondering this issue, his fists tightening around the reins he held. He might have been anxious about confronting the troops belonging to his brother, but if he wanted to be taken seriously, he needed to demonstrate that he would not back down from a fight. "Very well, move the troops. If they dare to enter these lands, you are free to intercept them. Show them the might of House Valyrian." Arthur's voice carried authority as he gave the command, and Roland nodded in agreement. He relayed the orders to his men, who quickly sprang into action and right behind their commander. Theodore's troops that were pursuing them quickly arrived at this scene, and the comb of their knight commander became visible. The man was riding in the front and began to slow down the moment he saw the small army waiting for them. The border between Albrook and Aldbourne was marked by a rugged landscape of rolling hills and sparse vegetation. Nearby, dense patches of forests housed creatures that occasionally emerged to ambush merchants and travelers. Though the volcanic lands were fertile, the absence of farmlands was noticeable due to the persistent threat posed by the monsters. A rock formation delineated the boundary between Aldbourne and Theodore's lands, and their troops were assembled near it. Alphonse, one of Theodore's knight commanders, rode at the head of his troops. He had split off from them and appeared to be attempting a charge into enemy territory. However, upon realizing that he was facing a sizable force led by a fellow Villaraian, he quickly brought himself to a halt. His steed trotted forward and stopped just short of crossing the border. Now, he stood before Roland, surrounded by other knights, with Arthur visible in the distance. "Halt, you are attempting to trespass into the lands of Lord Arthur Valerian, identify yourself." Alphonse straightened in his saddle, his gaze locking onto Roland with indignation. He recognized Roland's identity as the knight commander he had interacted with before. Luckily, he was not aware that he was the same man who took him on a wild goose chase and crashed the slaver's wagon. "Sir Wayland, pray tell, how did you?" The man was clearly shaken by the appearance of the enemy troops. When Emerson visited Albrook, they hadn't been able to resist even one Tier 3 class holder. Now, on the other hand, he could discern the presence of at least 5 other such individuals here, along with over 100 mounted troops. Behind them stood archers and foot soldiers armed with shields and spears, ready to mobilize at a moment's notice. "State your business. Are you trying to attack the lands of our lord? Why have you brought your knights here? We do not take kindly to such threats. Are you trying to start a conflict?" Roland knew that it was forbidden for the Duke candidates to engage in such extreme conflicts and battle it out on the fields. They were still nobles from the same house, and the Duke did not want to risk losing his troops to his son's disputes. The intention was for them to expand their influence without resorting to militarized conflict, or at most, only engaging in skirmishes under the guise of training exercises. However, Theodore's actions suggested otherwise, as his troops were invading his lands without going through the proper procedures. "Sir Wayland, it doth appear a misconception hath arisen. We possess no inclination towards strife. Nay, our presence in this place is solely to ensure the protection of our lands and the welfare of our people." Alphonse replied quickly while also raising his hand up. This caused the men behind him to stop in their tracks and gather at a distance. It was clear that he didn't want to give Roland any excuses to attack him. At this moment, Alphonse found himself at a disadvantage, as most of his troops had not yet arrived. It would be impossible to prevail against hundreds of enemies with only 30 of his men, especially against someone who had defeated Emerson, a truly strong knight commander. "Verily, I do assure thee, we harbored no intent to encroach upon thy lord's domain. Our sole aim was to conduct a vigilant patrol along the frontier, safeguarding the sanctity of our own estates. As thou art well aware, the locality hath witnessed a surge in the nefarious exploits of monsters and brigands in recent moons. We have diligently pursued one such miscreant. It doth appear that thou hast encountered this vagabond." Roland wasn't fond of the man's rhetoric, but it was evident he was attempting to buy time. He was at a large disadvantage with only 30 men here and waiting for reinforcements. The pursuers weren't elite forces, and their numbers didn't surpass his own. It would be unwise for them to encroach on their lands unchecked, and Roland needed to ensure they understood they couldn't trespass at will. "Yes, as you can see, we have apprehended a peculiar mage and a strange flying carriage has crashed into our territory. It doth indeed appear thus. Permit me to remind thee that this scoundrel hails from the domain of Lord Theodore Valerian and hath purloined goods from within his domain. I beseech thee, do the honourable deed and surrender them unto us, and we shall forthwith take our leave." "Is that so?" "I refuse." "Surely thou jest." Roland had anticipated this reaction, which is why he had instructed Arthur to prepare a body double. As they conversed, Alphonse caught sight of a figure in a dark robe being escorted away and placed into a carriage. It seemed he was being taken to Albrook for further interrogation, and his side would examine the wreckage, something Theodore's faction strongly opposed. It was evident they didn't want the captured children to divulge information about the kidnappings and the illicit slave trade, as it could lead to consequences even for their lord. "I am quite serious. If you attempt to cross into our territory, I will not hesitate to defend it." As a knight commander of House Valyrian, it is my duty to protect these lands and their inhabitants. Your accusations against this mage may be valid, but the matter will be settled within our jurisdiction. If you wish to pursue justice, I suggest you do so through proper channels. However, I must warn you that any attempt to enter our territory without our consent will be met with force. Alphonse's expression darkened at Roland's words, his hand twitching as if itching to draw his sword. He clearly didn't expect such firm resistance, especially from someone he had previously underestimated. It was a risky move, but Roland knew he had the advantage here. His troops outnumbered Alphonse's, and they also had the law on their side. In theory, whatever ended up in Arthur's territory was his to examine. Roland also knew they wouldn't divulge the truth about the wagon's purpose or its passengers. Which meant that they had nothing to stand on. Sir Wayland, thou shalt regret thy insolence. If you have nothing further to add, then leave. With a frustrated growl, Alphonse spurred his horse and turned back to his men, barking orders to regroup and return to Aldbourne. Though he seethed with anger, he knew better than to engage in a fruitless confrontation. The risk of provoking a conflict with Arthur Valyrian was too great and would only risk the ire of his liege. He knew that he could just deny all the claims made by his enemies, and it was not worth risking his men's lives in a meaningless battle. As Alphonse and his men retreated, Roland breathed a sigh of relief. He had effectively thwarted any further confrontation from the man. Fortunately, Alphonse was intelligent enough to recognize that he wouldn't emerge victorious from this clash. Moreover, it would only reflect poorly on Theodore if his knight commander were to attack Arthur's troops while his brother was among them. Arthur's mere presence made it challenging for the knight commander to retaliate, and attempting to force their way in was futile given the presence of multiple Tier 3 class holders on their side. Yet tell them, Sir Wayland. Such a knightly tone. I'm impressed. Shut up you two. While gazing at the back of Alphonse's neatly combed helmet, Roland heard voices from behind. First came Armand with a quick one-liner, followed by Lobelia. After turning his head, he caught sight of Arthur attempting to suppress a laugh and Mary shaking her head. I want to go home. Well, that went better than expected. For a moment I thought he was going to try something. That would be quite dumb if he did. Even if the rest of the troops arrived, their chances of winning were slim. More troops were coming? How many more were there? I'm not sure, it was hard to count, but probably around the same numbers we have here. Arthur looked at Roland with some concern in his eyes. I see. Well, we've sent a clear message today, and it's one that Theodore will have to reckon with. His knight couldn't act with me around, but that's something you probably anticipated, right? But I'm unsure if I like being used in such a way. I'm supposed to be the lord here. Roland knew that if this were a typical relationship and he was a real knight, such actions would have been inexcusable. Knights couldn't simply call on their lords for help while undertaking tasks they weren't ordered to perform. This incident demonstrated that Arthur was different from other nobles. He didn't seem offended by Roland's tone or actions. In fact, it seemed Arthur even enjoyed being asked for help. Perhaps, as his influence grew, he was beginning to relish his newfound authority and usefulness. The dust had settled, and Alphonse had retreated with his troops. Roland finally released a sigh of relief as things began to calm down. He had used new technology to open a portal, landing in enemy territory. Though his return had been tough, with the help of his friends and allies, the ordeal was now over. With this additional data, he would likely avoid making the same mistake again. But first, he needed to get back home. Thank you, my lord, your presence here was crucial. Oh, think nothing of it, Sir Wayland. It was quite invigorating, actually. My brother will probably be seething with anger once his knight makes the report. I wish I could see his face when he hears about this. Roland could sense a tinge of satisfaction in Arthur's words. It seemed Arthur relished the fact that his forces had made his brother look bad. Rumors were likely to spread about this confrontation, and Theodore might become the subject of ridicule at the next noble gathering. However, it was better not to poke a sleeping dragon, especially not while still being just a wyvern. Nevertheless, I didn't think you were such a gallant man. With the immediate threat dealt with, Roland and Arthur turned their attention to the group of orphans. It seemed that they were the reason for this whole debacle. Roland could see the men around him looking at him with strange expressions as if he had gained more of their respect. It was just a coincidence. A coincidence? Arthur raised a brow at the response, and Roland noticed that it was better to elaborate further. Theodore and his men were capturing people and turning them into illegal slaves. Oh? Those are some strong words, but do you have some proof? Roland nodded and pulled out some papers from within his spatial space. While there wasn't much within the dungeon they were holding the children in, after arriving at the building holding the slaver wagon, some paperwork could be gotten. The documents he gathered contained information about the captured people, their origins, and their intended destinations. These lack any signatures or seals that could be tied to Theodore, but it does mention this one merchant family. Are they connected? Roland nodded, confirming the Abrams family's involvement. However, this wasn't much to go on, as Theodore could easily deny any connection. The merchant would likely be used as a scapegoat and quickly replaced. Roland also lacked concrete evidence beyond the testimony of the young girl he had saved. Aubert Abrams would probably be silenced before any inquiry could be performed, making the issue difficult to resolve. Nonetheless, in this dispute between brothers, there were ways of gaining new territory, and Aldbourne could potentially qualify. Interesting, but I'm not sure if we are quite ready to start a territorial dispute with Theo yet. I think so, Lord Arthur. We should hold on to this information and use it when the time is right. They were still in the development stage. While their armies were growing, they needed more time. Arthur's troops would struggle against one of Theodore's knight commanders, and his brother had several of them. However, once Albrook began its expansion and the dungeon attracted enough people, they might be able to start pushing their luck. Roland also had some ideas to increase their military might using golems and possibly his phantom limb technology. Training soldiers took a lot of time, but a simple golem could replace a Tier 2 class holder. With his skills, a golemic army could be significantly strengthened and repeatedly restored. Once he fully completed his research, they might not even need people with combat classes anymore. If he was right, then even farmers could do their part inside of an army. Indeed. Sir Morian. Yes, Lord Arthur, how can I serve? After nodding, Arthur called over one of his proper knights, Sir Morian. The man was holding a large spear that needed some better enchantments. His armor was also not really something a knight commander-ranked individual should be wearing. It seemed that once he was back, Roland would have a lot of work on his hands. Will I be able to do everything in a month? This was indeed a perplexing situation, with time appearing to be a resource in short supply for Roland. For a fleeting moment, he pondered the prospect of delving into the study of time magic. Perhaps there existed a means to fashion a chamber where time flowed at a more sluggish pace, an ability often bestowed upon protagonists in various fictional tales. Now he found himself wishing he possessed such a capability as well, and perhaps it was not a pipe dream. Sir Morian, take half of the men and the 2 adventurers. Stay here and patrol our borders. If someone suspicious dares to cross it, you know what to do. Yes, my lord. Morian saluted and quickly guided his horse back to the soldiers, relaying the information. Armand didn't seem too happy to not be called by his name, but luckily Lobelia was there to pinch his arm before he said something to get them in trouble. Ow, I wasn't going to say anything. Sure you weren't. Don't worry, Wayland, leave this to me, I'll keep this idiot in check. She called out to Roland while pulling Armand away before he did something stupid. He watched the two with amusement but also relief that they were continuing to get stronger. His time invested in their equipment wasn't wasted, and they were people that even he could rely on. With these issues now over, he turned to the children that he had rescued. They looked quite confused about the situation and didn't seem to trust anyone around them. Sir Vico, don't worry, they are with me, we will head to Albrook now where you may rest and eat. Okay. The young boy nodded without asking too many questions, showing a trust in Roland's words. With Vico's help, the other children could be convinced easily. Roland hoped these children could act as witnesses to the slave trade incident. This would not be a one-sided arrangement, they would offer the children food and shelter in exchange for their testimony. Their accounts, combined with the documents, could provide enough leverage to keep Theodore's activities in check for a while. Might be better to keep them around my home, with the other orphans. With the help of spells, it was possible to easily extract the truth from most people. If they presented a case for dispute in the noble court, the children's testimonies could carry significant weight. This made the children potential targets, but the likelihood of Theodore going to great lengths for one city and a single revenue stream was low. Nevertheless, it was better to keep the children close and surround them with soldiers and golems for protection. With all of that out of the way, the two forces split. Half of the soldiers remained on the main road and prepared an encampment. The other half accompanied Roland, Arthur, and the children as they made their way back to Albrook. The journey was relatively uneventful, with occasional pauses to let the children have something to eat. Eventually, they arrived at the city he had left over a month ago. I'm finally back, not much time has passed but it felt like I was gone for half a year. Roland had finally returned home, but he knew there was little time for rest. While the situation with Theodore had been temporarily diffused, it was far from resolved. Lingering tensions with the Castellane house added to the complexity. He needed to reach out to his sister, who had promised to enlist their mother's help in addressing this issue. If his father intervened and resolved the matter, Roland might not need to return in a month's time to keep an eye on Lucienne. Can I build a proper teleportation gate in a month? Do we have enough materials for something like that? I should first make Bernier his arm, I can't imagine living without one. He continued to ask himself questions but his thoughts were interrupted by Arthur, who had caught on to this fact. Sir Wayland. Ah, yes Lord Arthur. You seem tired, how about you get some rest today, that's an order. No working. I understand, my lord. He wasn't sure how to respond to the order, so he simply nodded. Mary gave him a strange look, and perhaps everyone knew that he was already planning to overwork himself, as he usually did. Indeed, you are free to go, your wife is probably waiting for you and worried. Once you are rested, we shall talk about the future of Albrook. His home was now close by, and he continued while mounted. Behind him, a few soldiers followed, ready to guide his mount back once he was finished using it. The closer he got to his home, the more he felt like passing out as all the stress and adrenaline left his body. Eventually, he came to a stop and informed the men to take the horse away. It wasn't more than a few minutes from his home, and if he walked, he would probably be able to keep himself awake. I haven't been this tired in a long time. A sense of déjà vu washed over him as he approached his home. There, a lone woman stood waiting outside. Once their eyes met, she smiled, and the fatigue he felt seemed to dissipate. With slow steps, he continued to approach, releasing the safety on his helmet. Soon, he took it off, and the two exchanged warm, relieved smiles. "Elydia, I'm back," he said, his voice cracking slightly from exhaustion but also relief. "Welcome home, dear," she replied, her voice gentle and soothing, as she stepped forward, clearly intending to give her husband a warm hug after their time apart. However, before they could embrace, a noise from the distance caught their attention. It sounded like something was approaching from the forest, with the unmistakable sound of branches snapping underfoot. As the large beast burst through from within some bushes and appeared before them, Elydia reacted quickly by taking a step back. Unfortunately, her husband received the full brunt of the creature's attack. He went down to the ground as a rather overzealous crimson wolf tackled him down. Its moist tongue made its way to his face, beginning quite the slobbery assault. Agni, stop, get off me! It was Agni, his wolven companion that was the size of an adult horse. Agni's tail wagged furiously as he continued to lick Roland's face with enthusiasm. Despite being knocked down, Roland couldn't help but laugh at the overblown display of affection. Elydia watched with amusement as her husband wrestled with their oversized pet wolf. Looks like someone missed you even more than me. As Roland struggled to fend off Agni's affectionate onslaught, Elydia couldn't help but chuckle at the sight. She stepped forward and gently patted the wolf's head, causing him to pause momentarily in his enthusiastic display of affection. All right, Agni, that's enough. Let your master catch his breath. The Sunwolf obediently backed off, though his tail continued to wag excitedly. Roland pushed himself up from the ground, shaking his head as he wiped the wolf's slobber from his face. It was surprising to see him be so obedient for once, and perhaps during his absence, Elydia's and Agni's relationships had grown stronger. Looks like you've been taking good care of him. Roland replied while looking at his wife petting Agni, who was showing a rather silly reaction to getting his ears rubbed. One of his legs started to move around in response to all that rubbing. This was supposed to be a divine beast worshipped by the church, but at this moment, he looked more similar to a house dog than a mighty sunlight wolf. He has been keeping my company, but now that you are here, maybe I won't have to play nanny anymore. Worf. Agni gave out a dog-like bark, as if he was trying to deny the baby allegations. Both Roland and Elydia laughed, attempting to resume their embrace. However, right before they could get closer, the main door to his compound slammed open, and another person appeared to greet him. Boss, you're back. It was Bernier, his half-dwarven assistant this time around, and not far from him was his wife, Diana. But that wasn't all, behind them were more people. Jurg, the half-dwarven stonemason, Marcy the scribe, and even Finn, who was training to be a knight, were all here too. And that wasn't the end of it. Many of the young orphans could be heard in the distance. Their lodging had already been created, and they seemed to have moved into the new dormitory where Vico and the others would join them soon. Yes, I'm back, you seem to be doing well, Bernier. His friend was still missing an arm, and the replacement he had previously created wasn't on. It wasn't a pleasant sight, but Bernier didn't seem to mind that he was missing his arm from his elbow down. The entire journey had been initiated to find a solution to this problem without involving the Solarian Church any further, and soon he intended to tackle it in his workshop. However, before he started, he wished to enjoy the company of his wife, whom he hadn't seen in a month, and also rest. "Aye boss, good to have you back." "Welcome back, Mr. Wayland." Welcome back." Although he was tired, the sight of his friends and company waiting for his return, filled his heart with warmth. He did not think that something like this was possible when he set out on his journey, but they were there. Bernier moved over to give him a smack on the shoulder as a greeting, and then was quickly reprimanded by his wife. Soon, the kids started getting loud, and it took some time for them to settle down. They spent some time outside the shop but eventually moved into his compound. There, he briefly recounted the story of his journey, omitting a few details that he would share only with his wife later. "Well, it seems like you had quite an adventure, boss," Bernier said, shaking his head in amazement. "A shame I missed it. Not like you'd be of any help if you were there." "What do you mean? Just give me a runic weapon and I'll blow them all away." "Yeah, sure you will." Diana seemed annoyed with her boasting husband and kept shaking her head at his wild claims, which grew wilder the more he drank. Eventually, he became so inebriated that his wife had to carry him out of Roland's home. As the day came to an end, Roland felt the need to finally rest. Even though his mana and stamina had recovered, he still felt some lingering fatigue, likely brought on by a hidden status effect. "Finally, they are gone, how about you?" Elydia led the guests out, and upon returning, found her husband leaning back in his chair, his eyes closed. He had drifted away to sleep while sitting down, and next to him, a rather large wolf had decided to curl up. Its large size took up most of the dining area, and it had almost broken the door when entering. "I guess, it can wait until tomorrow." Elydia chuckles while bringing over a blanket that she tucked around her husband, making sure he was comfortable. She then moved to extinguish the candles around the room, leaving only the soft glow of the moon filtering in through the windows. With a gentle smile, she whispered a soft good night to both Roland and Agni before retiring for the night. The next morning, Roland woke up feeling more rested than he had in a long time. Sunlight filtered through the window, casting a warm glow across the room. He blinked a few times, adjusting to the light, and then noticed the woman dozing off against his bare chest. For a moment, he wondered how he entered this room, but soon he recalled dozing off in the dining room. "Alright, now I remember." His sleep had been short-lived due to a certain oversized wolf deciding to nap next to him. The snoring was so loud that his heightened senses mistook it for a monster attack. After waking up, he spotted the blanket Elydia placed over him, which he assumed she had done to ensure he was warm. Eventually, he found himself in their bed and had a nice intimate encounter with his wife. "It's good to be back." He gently moved, trying not to wake her, but her eyes fluttered open, and she smiled up at him, looking just as content as he felt. "Good morning, dear." "Good morning, Elydia. I didn't mean to wake you." She stretched, her smile already making this day a lot brighter. Roland was still getting used to being married and having someone who cared for him so deeply. It was a feeling he was slowly embracing. He was a loner, so having someone like Elydia by his side was somewhat new. However, it was not a burden but rather something that motivated him to strive even harder for their joint future. "Don't worry about it. I'm just glad you're back and I hope you'll be staying longer this time around." "I hope so, but... is it about your sister?" "Yes, but also a few other things." Elydia's voice was soft and full of warmth. She already knew about his adventures at the Magical Academy and the possibility of his return there. He had not detailed how he planned to return, but she had been informed about Lucien. Keeping secrets from his wife was not something he wished to do, and having someone who cared for him offer advice was always welcome. "Of course, but remember, you don't have to shoulder everything alone. If there is something I can help you with, just let me know, alright? If you keep saying things like that, I'm not sure I'll be able to control myself." Roland nodded at her words of support, his desire to tackle her down into bed once more momentarily overshadowed by the warmth of her encouragement. However, before his carnal instincts could take over, a loud sound echoed from inside his home. It sounded like scratching, and upon further investigation, it appeared to be Agni scratching against their bedroom door. His disappointment was immeasurable as he was forced to open the door. There he spotted Agni wagging his tail around, which caused some of the wooden chairs to break. Roland sighed, resigned to the fact that his time alone with Elydia was over, at least for the moment. With a sigh, he left his bedroom and pushed the oversized wolf out of his home. His size had become a problem and letting him inside was not the best idea anymore. "Dwarf. No, you can't stay inside, you have your own place, that's why we made it, go stay there." "Dwarf." Roland rolled his eyes as Agni continued to protest against being shoved out of the house. Luckily, with some coaxing and well-placed scratches behind the ears, Agni relented and trotted off to his designated wolf house. He looked a bit saddened and his tail was curling downward, but nothing could be done about it. His size was too large for his workshop, so he couldn't keep him company like he used to when he was a puppy. Maybe in the future, something could be done about that though. There was one idea in his mind that would allow his wolf companion access back into the underground smithy. His time at the institute was well spent and his research into dimensional magic had been extensive. If he was able to create the core of the structure he desired, then perhaps making some more space without digging around would be feasible. However, such things would need to wait for later as he first needed to do some other things. Does he seem more clingy than before? He just missed you, and then there are also the people from the Solarian Church, some of them can be peculiar. Once Agni was taken care of, he had a business meeting with his wife. She had kept informing him about the state of Albrook while he was gone, and there were indeed several pressing matters to attend to. The presence of the Solarian Church caused an influx of believers and refugees from other cities. A new growing city was always an opportunity to start over, so it attracted people that weren't necessarily able to bolster the economy. Work was scarce and the influx of people wasn't necessarily a good thing. If something wasn't done now, then in the future he knew that this place would resemble Aldbourne with its extensive slums and criminal element. I have my work cut out for me. Well then. Roland knew what had to be done, and soon he set off to take care of some business with Arthur. Over a month had passed since he had left this place, and the presence of the Solarian Church had only grown stronger. The priests and believers had set up new shrines and small temples, attracting a steady stream of pilgrims and new settlers to Albrook. Did they enlarge the main church through some magical means? I don't remember it being this tall. With the help of his helmet, he spotted a high concentration of people beneath the church, some of them belonging to the Solarian Paladin Order. It seemed they had begun expanding downward, likely digging to create more rooms for their priests and perhaps also escape tunnels. These cathedrals were large structures with thick walls that could become important military structures during a siege attempt. They wouldn't be easily breached, as they were reinforced with holy magic, which was particularly potent against undead and evil creatures. It was early in the morning, but already many adventurers were crowding the streets. Many of them seemed to be of the gold rank, but platinum ranks were also there. He noticed a few races he hadn't seen in a while, such as gnomes, who likely belonged to the recently formed alchemical guild. The same that wouldn't let rustics into their circle. The man would soon have some interesting work to do, and perhaps with it, he could show that they were mistaken. It's the Knight Commander, make way. As he was walking through the streets, people started moving to the sides. The cape he was wearing had the Valyrian crest on it, and he was also being followed by a small squad of soldiers. Roland didn't like the attention, but had already made peace with standing out. His 2-meter-tall armored form could no longer blend into the crowd. Soon, he found himself at Arthur's estate, ready for the strategic meeting. The estate was abuzz with activity as Roland arrived. Arthur had clearly been preparing for his return, and the knights and staff moved with purpose. Roland made his way through the familiar halls, greeted by nods and salutes from those he passed. His presence commanded respect, something that took a while to earn. Arthur was waiting for him in his office, where on his desk maps and documents were spread out. "Sir Wayland, good to see you. I trust you managed to get some rest." "Yes, Lord Arthur. Thank you. It was much needed." "Good, good. We have a lot to discuss. Please, take a seat." Mary was here with them, but they had to keep up the appearance of Lord and Knight Commander. Spies could be anywhere, and if someone noticed that Roland wasn't a true knight, there could be some potential trouble. Roland settled into a chair opposite Arthur, and finally, they could start discussing the future of the city. "We've made significant progress while you were away. The power grid that you proposed is almost finished, and that generator for the dungeon is ready. The dwarven craftsmen are waiting for you to supervise the installation." It seemed that a large chunk of work had been finished, and the city workers had laid out the bulk of the cables. What was left was to construct the main generator that would turn the dungeon's heat into power. For this purpose, he decided to go with geothermal energy, which consisted of tapping into the natural heat of the dungeon to generate electricity. The volcanic activity beneath the dungeon provided a consistent heat source, capable of boiling water and producing constant steam. It wasn't much different from the old steam generator he had once built. They just needed to create a water reservoir underground that would be heated by the dungeon's lava. Something like this could be easily achieved with the help of water magic. The heated water would produce steam at high pressure, which would then be pushed up into a turbine chamber. Once the turbine began spinning, it would start charging the generator to produce electrical energy. The cooled steam would turn back to water, which was then guided back to the water tank, and the process would repeat itself. That's excellent news, Lord Arthur. I'll begin overseeing the installation as soon as possible. Once the power grid is fully operational, we can start improving changes to the infrastructure and we'll have enough energy to bolster our defenses. Yes, the new golems and turrets. The dwarven craftsmen have been creating runic batteries, once they are charged. Roland nodded, as not only would the generator provide energy to the whole city, it would also be responsible for powering a regiment of their blossoming army. As it stood now, their forces were outnumbered. One knight commander from Theodore's side could call up troops that were equal to theirs, and this didn't account for mercenaries or adventurers that they could always hire. While golems couldn't truly replace real soldiers, they had one major advantage: they were cheaper in the long run and didn't require sleep or be paid. With the dungeon being a gold mine, gathering resources for their production wasn't hard either. Things are looking great, but we need to be vigilant. I'm not sure my brothers will just stand idle and let this city grow. Probably not. He nodded, recognizing that with time, Arthur was becoming a thorn in Theodore's side. It was wise to address a problem early on, as allowing it to fester could lead to much larger issues down the line. They anticipated sabotage attempts and efforts to hinder the city's growth. A direct assault was unlikely, but even nobles had their hidden organizations that functioned similarly to the Thieves' Guild, or even hired them directly. Fortunately, the Thieves' Guild master was their ally, so they had one less problem to worry about. If a mission were directed against them, they expected her to inform them or handle the issue at her leisure. Have you managed to recruit any members to your group? There are a few promising recruits, but we are still looking, replied Mary as Roland inquired about the ninja organization that she was responsible for. It was best to fight fire with fire, and having a group of assassins was part of being a high noble. With his technology, Arthur's compound was quite safe, but the runic devices weren't perfect. The scanners he used worked on monopattern recognition that could be fooled by skilled individuals. Having a group of trained assassins would serve as a deterrent and also allow them to gather intelligence and perform covert operations when necessary. Well then, about the other issues. They continued discussing the city and its challenges. With 2 competent Tier 3 knights present, his responsibilities as a knight commander could be delegated to them. They could handle training the new recruit and maintaining the command structure. Meanwhile, he could focus on his strengths, designing innovative runic devices and crafting armor. Well then, Sir Wayland, I won't detain you for too long. I understand your eagerness to continue your research, but we must prioritize getting the generator in order first. I agree. However, once it's assembled, I'd like to proceed with my other project, if that's fine with you, my lord. Certainly, that's acceptable. The decision had been made, and the geothermal power plant needed to be constructed first. Although he was eager to begin crafting the prosthesis immediately, the generator parts had already been completed. He could also enlist the aid of his dwarven allies to fashion a suitable replica for Bernier's arm, one that wouldn't necessitate a backpack with batteries for operation. Once both of these tasks were completed, he would also need to refurbish his own battle armor. The runes on it had been used up repeatedly and fallen in rank. The only way to restore them would be to erase the old ones and craft them again from the start. However, he wasn't sure if that would be all. The phantom limb technology that he had developed could be used in various ways, not only to restore missing arms. In theory, he could create something akin to power armor or even larger constructs if given enough time. It was time to move, and Brovia was probably tired of pushing back the project in his absence. After going outside, he first made sure that all the turrets in Arthur's villa were in good shape before moving towards the Union's forge. To his surprise, he didn't find his master Runesmith friend there. He was informed that she had already done most of the heavy lifting. They were waiting for him at the dungeon, which he appreciated as it saved him a lot of precious time. The city was bustling with activity, the streets were filled with merchants peddling their wares, adventurers boasting about their latest conquests, and workers hurrying to their jobs. It was a vibrant scene, but there was no time to enjoy the sights as he needed to be at the dungeon. Thankfully, his current standing made navigating there quite straightforward and was aided by a borrowed mount. The horse wasn't slow, yet it wasn't fast either. Perhaps he would have to reconsider going back to an older product he used to rely on as a horse replacement. He could see it flourishing after the magical energy was supplied to the city and they had readily available charging stations. After reaching the dungeon entrance, he ventured inside. The craftsmen were situated in a deeper section, which had been scouted beforehand. The placement of the water container required precision, near the lava yet not at risk of collapsing. Fortunately, his mapping device pinpointed a spot devoid of monster interference. The business seems to be thriving. En route, he encountered spider golems darting about, presumably returning from aiding a stranded adventurer. Deaths in the dungeon had reached an all-time low, with his golems being rented by nearly anyone with coin to spare. This enabled the city to gradually recoup the golems' costs, and they were close to making profits on their investment. Well, look who decided to finally show up. Good day, Master Brolvia. His Master Runesmith acquaintance appeared somewhat annoyed by his arrival, having been forced to wait for his approval. From her perspective, it was impolite to have someone of comparable expertise scrutinizing her work. Nonetheless, the technology was his invention, and spotting errors in runes was his forte. The debugging skill that had helped him to get this far was activated, and he began to quickly go over the large metallic container that would become part of their new geothermal power plant. While the runic structures weren't all of the highest order, the craftsmanship wasn't bad. What impressed him most wasn't the runic work but the meticulous structuring of the cave. The entire space had been excavated to perfectly fit the water container, with the walls reinforced with metal to prevent the dungeon from closing in on them, similar to the door he had previously constructed with Bernier. Overall, this looks good, Master Brolvia. I don't see any major issues with the runes or the structural integrity. Of course it does, I made sure of that. She replied, her tone sharp as she bristled at his inspection. Despite her gruff demeanor, Roland knew she took pride in her work, and rightfully so. Brolvia quickly nodded at her people and they began with the assembling process, which would take a while. The heat here was quite immense, but with some runic magic, a barrier of cold was created around the workers. Roland watched closely as the dwarves deftly maneuvered the heavy metal components into place, securing them with enchanted bolts that ensured both stability and durability. The container was positioned perfectly over a magma vent, which was a critical aspect of their geothermal energy system. Everything is progressing smoothly. At this pace I'll be free to make that limb, but that might not even be the most tiresome task. While looking over the installation, Roland's thoughts drifted to the upcoming challenges beyond the generator. Constructing the prosthesis for Bernier was a complex task, but his mind kept returning to a different issue. His time here might have been limited, but to connect himself back to the mainland, he would need to begin building a structure similar to a mage tower. So, did you or did you not do it? Well, I'll take that as a no. You promised me you would tell your mother about what happened. This isn't a game, your life could be in danger. I know, I'll bring it up soon. Will you? Roland frowned at the young girl on the projection before him. He wasn't using a crystal ball but one of his runic devices that used illusion magic to produce an image resembling a hologram. The projection was in shades of blue, similar to old grayscale television sets from his original world. Yes, I promise, I'll do it this time. Oh, and about Robert. His sister Lucienne quickly changed the subject, as she was reluctant to contact their mother about the incident. Roland had anticipated this and called her as soon as he had some free time. It seemed she had started writing a letter but had only finished half of it. Nevertheless, she was taking steps in the right direction and had already asked their mother about Robert, though she hadn't disclosed everything. Yet, what about him? I'm not sure. Mother said she would look into it and that I shouldn't worry, but she was acting strange. Strange? Do you think she was keeping something from you? I don't know. Roland's frown deepened as Robert might have been in trouble. Lucien's mother was quite fond of her children, so it wouldn't be strange if she tried to shield them from any potential danger. This included sparing her daughter from worrying about any unfortunate situations her older brother might have encountered. Roland's instincts told him that there was more to this situation than met the eye, but he was unable to act. His hands were tied here in Albrook. I see. Could something bad have happened to Brother Robert? Maybe I should return home and ask Mother again. I'm not sure if that's a good idea. You'll be safer at the Institute. But if you want to hasten the process, maybe tell your mother about Viola Castellane. Your father might be able to do something about it. Roland could see his sister's eyes darting around. It was as if she didn't want to involve their father, and he somewhat knew why. The man was very distant and involved in many political affairs, making him intimidating. Lucien's reluctance was understandable, as she probably didn't know their father too well. He was rarely home, and it was natural that she didn't know how to talk to him. To her, the man called Wentworth might as well have been a stranger just like he was to Roland. I'm not sure if that man would even act. I hope he doesn't force Lucien to apologize or remove her from the Institute to appease that family. Roland's thoughts lingered on the complexities of his family's situation as he concluded the conversation with his sister. Lucien's reluctance to involve their father was troubling, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened to his older brother Robert. However, there was something in the way Francine was acting that gave him an idea about the situation. It seemed that she knew more than she let on, which might mean that Robert's situation was not as dire as it appeared. Lucien, promise me that you'll own up to your mother. The longer you try to postpone this issue, the worse it will get. I know, and I will. Perhaps, if she isn't willing to talk about Robert with you, try mentioning something to her. Oh? What should I mention? That you met a very responsible institute professor who might be willing to help with a few issues. Roland was talking about himself, and Lucien raised an eyebrow at the self-promotion. She responded with a resounding nod as if she made a decision, and eventually the two said their farewells. The call ended and the holographic image fizzled out, leaving Roland deep in thought. The installation of the geothermal generator was well underway, but the concerns about his family weighed on his mind. The city's progress and his inventions were important, but so was the welfare of his two siblings. I bet Francine knows more than she would ever tell Lucien. Given her character, she would do anything to help her children but will never make them worry. There was a reason he told his sister to mention the eccentric institute professor that was for some reason willing to help them. Perhaps once out of options, this little window of opportunity would prompt Francine to reach out to him directly. Mentioning his involvement in the recent issue with Viola could also prompt her to seek him out. She would probably wish to thank him in some way and perhaps offer some bribes for further protection. Then, he might be able to push for the answers that he was seeking. Can't do much now besides preparing for the future. Roland turned on the light and looked around his workshop. He was waiting for someone to arrive, and right on time, he heard some footsteps in the distance. A lone man appeared, his height short and his beard long. It seemed to have grown a bit, but this was not anything too eye-catching, the lack of a limb was. Hey boss, you wanted to see me? Yeah, there is one question I want to ask you. A question? Sure boss, what is it? Do you want to have your arm back? Ha, well, if you have a spare one then let me borrow it. Bernier chuckled under his breath, clearly trying to lighten the mood, but Roland could see the flicker of hope in his eyes. The loss of his arm had been a devastating blow, and despite Bernier's efforts to adapt, it was evident that he longed for his former capabilities. At this point in time, he only had a basic golemic arm that could not really replace his hammering hand too well. The day before, he had asked Elydia about how he was faring, and it seemed he wasn't doing too well. Without his right arm, he was stuck trying to restrain himself with his left one, which was progressing slowly. It wasn't easy to switch dominant hands, especially when one had spent their entire life perfecting their craft with the other. Even with the aid of skills, this was not a task that could be easily completed. I do have something in mind, actually. Something that might be able to help you. Bernier's eyes widened with surprise, but he then quickly shook his head around as he knew what Roland was implying. Boss, please don't do anything foolish. I know you signed some deal with those Solarian zealots, but you don't have to go that far for me. I'll be fine. It might take a few more months, but I've already been getting better with my left hand. Think you are misunderstanding something. I wasn't talking about asking for a tier 4 priest or even an elixir. But I guess, it's better if I show it to you. Show me what? Your new arm, or well, a drawing of it, that is. We still have to make it first. We have to make it. Bernier was confused about the situation. He had heard that Roland was going to a magical academy for some research, but he wasn't sure he believed that Roland could produce results in such a short amount of time. Even if Roland could help him, the expectations were for it to take a few years at least. It was never before seen magical technology, and Roland was still a young craftsman. However, when he saw a large board with an intricate diagram of a forearm, his mind went blank. This is... Yes, this is it. While it's still a rough sketch, I think as a prototype, it will serve as a full replacement for your missing arm. It's not just any ordinary prosthetic, it's a combination of magic and runic technology. With this, you'll be able to regain much if not all of the functionality you lost. Wait, hold on boss, let me get this straight. You're saying you've come up with a way to give me back my arm? And not just any golem arm, but one that works like the real thing. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. It's not going to be easy, and it might take some time to perfect, but I believe it's possible. I still haven't decided on an attachment mechanism that would allow the arm to stay connected to the flesh, but Rastix said that he could have a solution for that. Bernier was speechless, his eyes fixed on the detailed diagram in front of him. He traced his fingers over the lines and runes, trying to comprehend the complexity of what Roland was proposing. I don't know what to say, boss. This is incredible. But are you sure it's possible? I mean, magic and runic technology, that's some serious stuff, it can't be cheap. It seemed Bernier wasn't sure if he deserved the investment. He knew, from a craftsman's perspective, that such a runic prosthetic, if successful, would be literally worth an arm and a leg. In normal circumstances, only super-rich merchants and nobility could afford something like that, and he was just a simple blacksmith who had lost one of the main tools to earn money. Don't worry, it's going to be free of charge, but well, you might be the very first person in the world to get such an arm, so in a way, you're also helping me test my invention. In a way, it might be me who should be paying you instead, but I guess, I already am. Bernier chuckled at the little joke, but the gratitude on his face was showing. Roland couldn't really force his assistant to go through with this, and there were some dangers associated with untested magical technology. He did not know if there were any drawbacks of using such a runic prosthesis which used the soul to guide it. His friend here could be considered a guinea pig, and if he declined, then he would understand. Haha, great, let's make that arm then. I'll understand if you'd like to rethink the... Hey? You're okay with it, just like that. Roland paused for a moment as he wasn't sure if Bernier comprehended the drawbacks of this deal. Boss, what's there to think about it? But do you understand that this is going to be a prototype of magic that has never been tested before, right? Sure. Not like my arm is going to explode again, right? Bernier chuckled as if he was proud of the joke that he made. I trust you, boss. If something goes wrong, you'll be the first one to stop it. I see. A faint smile crept onto his face, though it quickly disappeared. For some reason, he felt happy that someone had so much trust in him, but it was also a burden. He was sure that even if Bernier lost another limb during the tests, he would still not blame him. This was a lot of trust that someone was putting into his skills, and he didn't want to disappoint him. Well then, where do we start? First, we'll need to prepare a basic prototype, nothing too fancy. Deep steel should be enough. The runes used for this are surprisingly gentle. Once we get the initial alpha tests out of the way, we can move on to the full prototype. Sounds good. They spent the next few hours discussing the specifics of the prosthetic, with Roland explaining each component and its function. Bernier listened intently, his eyes sparkling more and more as he listened to the way this new magical limb would function. First off, I decided to go with these puppet hands that mimic joints the best. We will make them a bit thicker to resemble your hands. You'll be able to exert even more grip strength than before, but that's something that we can adjust later. There were many golems, and most did not focus on mimicking human hands and their dexterity. To alleviate this problem, Roland asked Arian for some help. To his surprise, there were certain shapely puppets used in the industry that mimicked human behavior. They were quite rare and costly, but some people were apparently willing to invest in them due to their remarkable precision and lifelike movement. He decided to hide this fact from his friend, as he wasn't sure if he would appreciate knowing what his new hand was originally designed for. If it all works, then perhaps we'll add some other adjustments later. Oh? What other adjustments? Well, it's still a golem arm, so besides being flame-resistant, I was thinking about giving it the capability to magnetize tools for better grip. Perhaps it could even be used as a weapon, but I guess we should get the alpha prototype ready before we discuss that. I have already contacted Brulvia about some parts, and they should be ready soon. Finally those bastards are good for something, but then what will we be doing? I just gave them a partial schematic for now, we still need to prepare the most crucial parts and make you a new harness. Bernier nodded as Roland continued to explain the plan. The Dwarven Union was their ally, but this didn't mean he would give them the plans for his prototype. They would prepare the basic framework for the arm while he handled all the runesmithing himself. They would probably assume he was just preparing a new golem and think nothing of it. Soon the two craftsmen were busy at work. Over the next few days, Roland and Bernier dove into the creation of the prosthetic arm. The workshop buzzed with activity as they meticulously crafted each component. First on their agenda was the harness for their testing arm. The one he would create took inspiration from modern designs. It consisted mostly of adjustable leather straps with padded sections on Bernier's right side. Its purpose was to distribute weight evenly and reduce strain on his body. Chafing was also a concern, but Bernier didn't seem to mind, as this was intended to be just a temporary solution. Next on the agenda were the runic batteries, which were the heart of the design. Luckily, thanks to his recent research, Roland became capable of creating even smaller runes than before. In the finished product, they would be directly inserted into the side portion of the forearm, which would mostly be empty inside. By his calculations, it would be feasible to get around a day's worth of functionality out of one enhanced battery before it needed to be replaced or recharged directly. Soon the two started their tasks. Bernier's job was to create the harness for himself while Roland would take care of the new batteries that also needed to be tested. Eventually, a box filled with the golemic hands arrived and their work was in full swing. The Ethereum proportions are barely adequate, but this should be enough for now. He scrutinized the work of the Dwarven Union, but he couldn't complain. They had performed the task just as he asked for and kept the deadline he gave them. Roland couldn't shake off the feeling of excitement mixed with anxiety. This project was a leap into the unknown and he wasn't sure what to expect. Each rune etched into the arm had to be precise, each magical conduit and trace perfectly aligned. One mistake could lead to catastrophic failure, not just for the arm but potentially for this underground workshop. He had already blown up one workshop in the Institute and he didn't want to repeat the failure from that day. With his debugging skills, he was able to identify and address all possible weak spots in the design, continuing to iron them out. The two men found themselves working overtime into the night, much to the dissatisfaction of both their wives. However, their spouses were understanding enough to allow them to continue, recognizing that the project was something truly special. After about a week, the alpha prototype was finally ready, and it was time to see if Bernier would regain the use of his arm. "All right, this is the moment of truth," Roland said, his voice tinged with both anticipation and concern as he held up the newly forged prosthetic arm. The intricate runes glowed faintly, casting a soft blue light in the dimly lit workshop. Bernier sat nearby, wearing a strange bowl-shaped helmet over his head. Cables attached to the chair gave the setup an eerie resemblance to the electric chairs used for executions. Additionally, a panel with some writing was to the side with what looked to be a silhouette of a person presented on a graphical interface. Boss, what is all of this for?" Bernier's nervous chuckle echoed in the workshop as he glanced around at the unfamiliar equipment. Roland was engrossed in making final adjustments for the runic limb and didn't immediately respond. He was focused on ensuring everything was in place for the first test. "It's something like a monitoring system but will also allow you to alter the settings even when I'm not here. We need something to track your body's responses to the artificial limb." His battle armor could do many things, but it wasn't meant to be a diagnostic device for runic limbs. For this reason, he decided to assemble a chair that would monitor a patient's vital signs. Its main purpose was to record the spiritual mana pattern along with the regular kind. There was a certain attunement needed for the limbs to work, and there was a possibility of misalignment over time. This chair was designed so that, even in Roland's absence, Bernier could fix any issues by himself. "I see." Bernier nodded slowly, trying to suppress his anxiety. The idea of being the first person to test a never-before-seen magical prosthetic was quite terrifying but also thrilling. Roland's confidence was reassuring, but the half-dwarf could not help but feel stressed. He trusted Roland but there was always a chance of things going wrong and he certainly did not want to explode while testing new runic equipment. "Are you ready? First, we'll connect the arm to the harness. Once it's secure, I'll activate the runes, and we'll see how it responds to your spiritual mana." "Aye, boss." His assistant was ready to proceed, even though he didn't fully understand the mechanics behind this new technology. He wondered how it would work. Would he be able to move his hand again as he used to? Would it even give him the sensation of touch or would it just be a minor upgrade from the golemic arm he had been trying to use for the past month? Roland took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. This was the culmination of weeks of intensive work and research. It was the moment that would determine if his decision to go to the institute was right. He attached the prosthetic arm to the harness, ensuring it was secure. The intricate runes along the length of the arm glowed faintly as he continued to adjust the parameters. Attuning it to Bernier's soul wasn't as easy as working with his own, but eventually, everything clicked into place. "Everything seems to be in order." "Okay, Bernier." "Yes, boss. I'm going to boot it up. I'm not sure how you will feel during the activation process but there might be a slight tingling sensation at the start." "Ah, all right." Bernier nodded, gripping the arm of the chair tightly. Roland began to chant softly, his voice resonating with the magical frequencies embedded in the runes. The glow intensified, spreading from the arm to the harness and finally to Bernier's body. The runes on the arm flared up briefly before settling into a steady glow, indicating the successful establishment of a magical connection. As the runic prosthetic came to life, Bernier's eyes widened in amazement. He felt a strange warmth spreading from the connection point where the arm met his flesh, radiating outward until it filled the entire limb. There was indeed a tingling sensation, not unpleasant but certainly unique. "How does it feel?" Roland asked while keeping his skills activated. The world in front of him was filled with mana particles, and he could see the mana phantom from Bernier's limb twitching. The prosthetic was connecting to it and slowly adapting to the spiritual mana there. It took about a minute for the connection to be established, and it seemed to be a success. It feels strangely warm. I can feel something, like it's a part of me, but also not. It's hard to explain. Try moving it around." It was finally time to see if his research had been fruitful. Everything seemed to be working fine, but there was a chance that it could all be for nothing. Bernier was still missing an arm, and if he couldn't make the prosthetic move, then everything would be meaningless. Roland assumed that the phantom limb phenomenon would take hold, but first, he needed to see if Bernier could actively control the prosthetic. Bernier flexed his new fingers cautiously. At first, the movements were jerky and uncoordinated, but as he concentrated, they grew smoother. The arm responded to his will with surprising accuracy, and he was soon able to perform basic gestures. It was clear that he would need some time before he could use it, but it was a resounding success. By the gods, it's moving. I can feel it moving. Bernier's voice was filled with awe and excitement as he flexed the fingers of his new prosthetic arm. The movements were slightly jerky and there seemed to be a slight delay, but once they moved on from the alpha model, this problem would be non-existent. The soul always moved before the body did, and so did the mana phantom Roland could see. He needed to account for this and attune it to Bernier's deposition. Good, how about you try making some simple hand gestures like making a fist or moving your fingers one at a time? Sure thing. Roland watched with relief as Bernier's new arm performed simple tasks like opening and closing his hand. The glow from the runes pulsed rhythmically each time, activating whenever the soul energy was initiated. The connection between Bernier's spirit and the mana receptors was quite stable. For once, everything seemed to be working just as he had intended. Boss, this is great. I have to show this to Diana. Now, hang on for a minute. This device isn't ready for public use quite yet. How about, you try holding this first? Bernier seemed eager to storm off the chair to show his new prosthetic to his wife, but it was quite dangerous to use. There was one thing that his assistant had forgotten about, and this next test would showcase it. Roland had prepared an apple which he placed in the palm of this deep steel arm. Now, try squeezing it, gently. Sure, like this. Oh! Soon, Bernier realized what Roland was getting at as the apple was crushed into chunks before his eyes. The runic prosthetic possessed the strength of a Tier 2 golem, without any inhibiting program limiting Bernier's soul. The power of this artificial limb exceeded what his natural strength could achieve, and it would likely take time for him to adjust. If he attempted to grasp his wife's hand in this state, he could accidentally shatter her fingers. Don't worry. This is just the alpha stage and it can be fixed. I think putting an inhibitor on it first should do the trick, but perhaps eventually you'll be able to learn how to fully use the limb's capabilities. That sounds reasonable. Fruit juice started leaking down onto the ground, and Roland quickly grabbed a towel from the side to clean up the mess on the artificial limb. Soon, it was time to move away from the chair and conduct some tests. However, the weight seemed to be a problem. When Bernier attempted to stand up, he started tipping to the right side. The harness they were using to attach the limb wasn't quite suitable, but it would have to do for now. I've prepared a few things for you, give it a try. On a nearby bench, Roland had laid out several objects of varying sizes and weights. He motioned for Bernier to approach and pick them up with his new prosthetic arm. The whole area was being monitored from all sides and information was being fed to the console he was now operating. They needed to get as much data for this arm as possible before they could move on to a finished product. Okay, how about you first try picking up that wooden hammer there and then the heavier metal one? Sure boss. Bernier reached out with his prosthetic arm, fingers curling around the handle of the wooden hammer. He lifted it effortlessly, but the wooden handle seemed to have suffered a few cracks. To alleviate this problem, Roland started playing around with the settings in an attempt to lower the grip strength on the new limb. Now try the heavier hammer. The arm appeared to be quite dexterous, allowing Bernier to grip onto things rather well. However, it still had some shortcomings. Occasionally, items would slip out of the metallic fingers, which were too slick. It seemed that having rougher skin affected one's grip more than anticipated, but it was a problem that could be addressed later. The hand may have been metallic, but that didn't mean it couldn't be coated with a special material or covered with a skin-imitating glove to mimic real skin. It presented a perfect opportunity for a certain alchemist to shine. This is incredible, it's much better than that other golem arm. It almost feels real. I see, how about the feeling of touch, can you feel anything at all? Roland approached Bernier and used his nail to poke at the metallic fingertips. He wasn't sure what to expect from the connection between the arm and the soul, but he hoped that it might be possible to fully regain the sense of touch. If such a breakthrough was achievable, then these prosthetic arms could indeed replace costly Tier 4 elixirs and the services of priests. It seemed to operate rather well even with non-Tier 3 materials, so it could perhaps be used by a wider range of individuals. Bernier blinked in surprise as Roland poked at his prosthetic fingertips. He concentrated, trying to discern any sensation. At first, there was nothing, just the metallic coolness of the arm. But then, faintly, he felt a tingling sensation, as if his own fingers were being touched. It wasn't a perfect replication of the sensation, but it was there, a glimmer of hope that perhaps with further refinement meant that the sense of touch could be eventually restored. There's something. It's not like the real thing, but it's there. I'm not really sure what to make of it, boss. Roland nodded thoughtfully, taking note of Bernier's observation. It was a promising development, one that would need further experimentation and tweaking to refine. But if they could truly replicate the sense of touch, it would revolutionize this new field of prosthetics. It would take some time before he could make it official, but if touch could be restored, then this was a breakthrough he did not expect. That's good to hear. It means the connection is working. With more fine-tuning, I believe we can enhance the sensitivity and make it feel more natural. Bernier flexed his fingers again, a smile forming on his face as he started to get used to the new sensations. Boss, this is incredible. I don't know how to thank you. No need for thanks, Bernier. This is just the beginning. We still have a lot of work ahead to perfect this. But if you want to thank me, then get ready for more tests. The craftsmen nodded at each other as it was time to perform the usual stress tests for new products. All sensors were on Bernier, and his job was to use the new prosthetic as much as possible throughout the day. The battery life needed to be tested, as well as the usage of the runes. In the future, Roland planned to introduce a power-saving mode that the limb would enter automatically, but for now, more tests were needed. I'm up for it. Let's keep at it, boss. With the initial tests showing promise, Roland and Bernier delved deeper into the calibration and fine-tuning of the prosthetic arm. Roland made notes on Bernier's feedback, adjusting the runes to refine the sensory input and finger control. The process was grueling and involved countless adjustments, but Bernier's enthusiasm never waned. Eventually night arrived and it was time for a break, but his assistant didn't seem to want to part with his new arm. I don't think it would be a good idea to take it home with you, it's still experimental technology. That's true, but what if I just stay here for the night? What about your wife? Will she be fine with you staying at the workshop? Probably not, you're right, it's probably not safe around the little one either. With a heavy heart, Bernier gave up on showing the new arm to his wife and child. He had still trouble controlling his strength and there was always a possibility of something going awry. The arm was stored away for further testing tomorrow and eventually Bernier left the workshop with his old piece of equipment. Roland was left alone to ponder the next step, which entailed renovating the workshop. One down and another one to go. He mumbled to himself while heading to the elevator that would take him to the lowest section of his workshop. It had been designed with one thought in mind: further expansion and security. Some of the technology he created was quite dangerous, so it was better to place it between layers of reinforced magical rocks that could absorb any potential explosions. The elevator came to a halt on the bottom level, which was currently empty. Here, he would attempt to create his next invention. The walls were thick and sturdy, adorned with various runic symbols embedded in the rocks. Metal wasn't the only material capable of holding runic traces and structures. This had been demonstrated to him back at the Institute, which had many enchanted surfaces not made of metal. During his research on mage towers, he learned about specific techniques used to alleviate the challenges of runesmithing with non-metal materials. It was possible to reroute a lot of the strains of the runes into specific sections of the tower. These would be made from precious materials like mithril or other magical alloys specifically created for consistent use, just like his armor. The most pivotal element of the tower was its core, as it would handle most of the strain and calculations. It was in a sense the main power source and the main frame. I hope this won't come back to bite me in the ass later, but I don't think I'll be able to make it within the next few weeks otherwise. Roland stepped toward a lone workbench in the center of the chamber. The place was devoid of much, but he intended to fill it with various runic artifacts to support his new project. While constructing a full-blown magic tower would take too long, he planned to start small and create something else first, a teleportation gate. With it, he intended to create a gateway for himself that would connect him with the entire kingdom, making travel something trivial. Alright, let's get started. To begin, he needed to create the core to funnel everything into and the artificial spirit that would function as a supercomputer. For this task, he chose an old enemy, or, to be exact, its remains. He produced a cracked orb and placed it on the workbench. It would serve as the blueprint for his runic version of a tower spirit. It was a monster core that once belonged to a peculiar lich monster affected by his otherworldly mana. This bonding effect would simplify things greatly, and soon it would be time to start his next project. This will probably take longer than just a week, so I better start now. After rubbing his tired eyes, he dropped down a large notebook on his workbench. It was time to make a magical AI, and in a sense, he was quite excited about this next project that could open a plethora of future possibilities.